Good morning, gentlemen.
Good
Good
morning.
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 I hope everybody was able to go through the Gemara for yesterday. As I said, these are long amudim, so it makes it a little bit more difficult to cover some of the material in time for me to include the Shabbos. Okay, but we're on 135 today. Okay, that's today's daf, but I'm going to start really on the very bottom of 134b, the last line, I think. So that should help us, where it said Safek va'androgonus, right? So, Tanu Rabbanan says the Braita, or Lato, when it refers to his flesh, his foreskin, or Lato Vadai, Dochet HaShabbat, that if it's clearly a situation where one has a visible foreskin, okay, so that would clearly rule out a tumtum. And androgynous, however, the question is still, is that person have an orla? If we don't know what specifically the gender of the person is. So if it's very clear that they have an orla, that would be doche Shabbat. Okay, and now we go over to the top of Kaf Lamed Hey. Okay, however, says the Gemara, velo safek dochet Shabbat, and not if there's an uncertainty, if the person has a foreskin. Okay, Welato vadai dochet Shabbat. Therefore, says the Gemara, right, in this situation, if we know is an orla there, then that allows us to say Mila is Doche Shabbos, Velo androgynous Dochet HaShabbat, but not a hermaphrodite. Okay. Now, Gemara wants to pick up and continue with this discussion, right? Because Rabbi Yehuda Omer, androgynous Dochet HaShabbat. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says that the Mila for an androgynous does supersede the Shabbat, and there is also, however, Va'anush Karet, and there's also a punishment of Karet if that person is not circumcised. Orlato Vadai Dochet Shabbat, says the Gemara, right? And we have a statement that says that's very clear that when it is someone who has a foreskin, okay, that Mila is Docha Shabbat. All right. However, the Gemara text continues, Velo nolad ben hashmashot Dochet Shabbat. But someone who was born at the twilight, for example, and therefore you don't know for sure which day was the actual day of birth, and so forth. In that situation, we cannot say that the Mila is going to supersede Shabbat. Again, Orlato Vadai Dochet HaShabbat, Velo Nolad Kashehu Mahul Dochet HaShabbat. Again, someone who has a foreskin, okay, to remove it, okay, it does supersede Shabbat, if that is, of course, the 8th day. But if the individual is born circumcised, okay, we have to assume that somehow that is possible, right? Doche et right? doche et Shabbat. Right? Does that situation does not supersede the Shabbat? Why? Shebeit Shammai omrim tzrich lahatif mimenu dam brit. Because according to Beit Shammai, one has to do hatafat dam brit on that individual. Beit Hillel omrim eino tzarich. And Beit Hillel claims that that is not necessary. Now, what's the point? Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Eliezer says as follows: Lo nechlaku Beit Shammai uBeit Hillel al nolad kasher hu mahu. That the disagreement between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel regarding a child who was born circumcised, shetzarich lahatif mimenu dam brit, okay, whether or not we have to perform hatafat dam brit on the child, that neish or la kivushahi. It's a situation where the foreskin was suppressed or concealed. Okay, al manechlaku. Okay, what then did they argue about? Al ger shenitkayer keshahu mahu. Rather, he argues, Rabbi Shimon, that their argument was based on a male convert who was converting when he already had been circumcised. Shebeit Shammai omrim tzrich lahatif mimenu dam. That Beit Shammai says we must draw a drop of blood, hatafat dam brit. Beit Hillel omrim ein sarich lahatif mimenu dam brit. And Beit Hillel says he does not have to have hatafat dam brit. However, okay, this would seem to imply that for it to be a valid conversion, the individual would still require immersion, tefillah. Okay? So that would almost seem to indicate that at a certain point in time, tefillah, immersion was the ikar for both men and women, and therefore, with a man, the circumcision was secondary. Now, Amar Mar, Master had said, we found a text, Velo safek delchet haShabbat, and if there is an uncertainty, this does not supersede Shabbat, right? La tuye mai, what is this coming to include? Okay, says the Gemara, La atuye ha detanu rabbanan, to include that which the rabbis taught. Ben shiv'ah mechalalin alav et haShabbat. Namely, that if somebody was an infant that was born in the 7th month, we're about a third down the page, half day down the page, Mandy, okay? Just below the Tosafot Lo Nichlakum. Okay? So to include what the rabbis taught, that when an infant, and this was the attitude at the time, okay? An infant born prematurely in the 7th month would normally survive, okay? And therefore, the attitude was, in that case, one could be basically desecrate the Shabbat for the Brit Milah. Uben Shmona, but a child born, an infant born, male infant born in the 8th month, Ein Mechalalina Lavet HaShabbat. That child did not necessarily survive, and therefore, okay, was not going to, their Brit Milah could not be done to desecrate the Shabbat. Next part, Safek ben Shiva, Safek ben Shmona. If there was a doubt as to whether the child was born in the 7th month or in the 8th month, Ein mechalalin alav et Shabbat. We do not then permit the desecration of the Shabbat, okay, in regards to that circumcision. Okay? Now, the issue may be a little more complicated in that why would they say that a 7th-month preemie, so to speak, be a valid birth, whereas an 8th-month preemie might not, right? The Gemara is going to now begin to attempt to address this. Ben Shmona, Harehu Ke'evin, okay? A child born in the 8th month is considered, the direct translation would be like a stone, okay? But what we have to understand is they're considered like a stillbirth. And in the stillbirth, okay, it's like a corpse. And therefore, one shouldn't handle it. And in that case, it would be considered muktzah. And therefore, for that reason, okay, va'asur l'taltalo. It's prohibited to handle it. Aval imo shoche umanikto mipnei hasakana. But nevertheless, we permit the mother to bend over and to nurse, to suckle the child because of potential danger to the mother. Okay? It also may be a way of determining, okay, if the infant is a viable birth or not. Now, we continue. Itmar. It was, however, stated. Okay? Now, this comes back to our discussion earlier in the Amud regarding a child who was born circumcised. Okay? And so Rav Amar, halacha ketanakama. Rav says the law is like Tanakama. Okay? And in that case, okay, Shmuel Amar halacha karabi Shimon ben Elazar. And Shmuel says the law is like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Now, the implication is that if the law is Tanakama, he says they don't, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel don't disagree. I'm sorry, they do disagree with one another. And when we make a psak, okay, we're paskening like Beit Hillel. And so therefore, in that case, okay, we see that Beit Hillel says we doesn't need hatafat dam. Shmuel, who says the law is like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, implies that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel really don't disagree, and therefore no hatafat dam is needed whatsoever. Again, it's the same result, but the approaches, the methodology, if you will, are different. Now, Rav Ada bar Ahava, it yalid le hahu yanuka kashahu mahu. Maisa, a story, an incident where Rav Ada bar Ahavas had a child, his wife, that infant was born circumcised. Ahadre atlesa mehulai. He went to 13 different Moalim. Ad shavye krut shufcha. Okay, none of the Moalim, okay, were ready to perform it. He did it himself, and as a result, he rendered the child a krut shifcha. In other words, he severed part of the urethra. Okay? Amar titili the avre adarav. He says this was a result, as if a punishment was put upon me because I transgressed the rule of Rav. Amarli Rav Nachman. And Rav Nachman responded to him, va'ad Shmuel lo avar, and the ruling in terms of Shmuel you did not transgress. Ema, I would say, the Amar Shmuel b'chol. Okay, that Shmuel was saying this in regards to only weekdays, right? The Shabbat, mi Amar, did Shmuel say this applied also to Shabbat? Okay, so who, namely Rav Ada bar Ahava, Savar Vadai Orla Kfushahi, okay, that he was of the opinion that in this particular case, it was a orla that was covered over, that was concealed. The Itmar Rabba, as Rabba says, Amar Chayshinan Shema Orla Kivushahi, that we need to suspect of the possibility of a concealed or suppressed foreskin. Now, Rav Yosef Amar, says Rav Yosef, Vadai Orla Kivushahi, okay, that in this case, okay, he's suggesting that doesn't he still, certainly it may have been a concealed foreskin, okay, and as a result, okay, it was necessary to perform the act. Amar Rav Yosef, Mina Aminala, on what basis do I say this? The Tanya Rabbi Elazar HaKafar, as taught by Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar in a Braita, Omer lo nichlaku Beit Shammai u Beit Hillel, that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel only disagreed al nolad kashehu mahul shetzrich lahatif mimenu dam brit, that with a child that was born circumcised, one required a hatafat dam brit. Al ma nechlaku, okay, on what did they disagree? Lechalel alav et haShabbat, whether it was permissible to do that hatafat dam brit on Shabbat for that infant that was born circumcised. Namely, Beit Shammai omrim mechalalin alav et haShabbat, that Beit Shammai said it is permissible to desecrate the Shabbat. Beit Hillel omrim ein mechalalin alav et haShabbat, and Beit Hillel argues that it is not permissible to desecrate the Shabbat in that case, in that situation. Now, so the Gemara now raises the point. Lav miklal the Tanakama savar mechalalin alav et haShabbat. Is this not based on the excuse me, on the general principle that Tanakama held that it is permissible to desecrate the Shabbat for Mila? V'dilma Tanakama divrei hakol ein mechalalin kama. And perhaps Tanakama was saying that it's really the view of all, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, that what they really were referring to was in that situation, it's not permitted to desecrate Shabbat. Im kain, Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar, but in that case, what about what was said by Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar? Tama de Beit Shammai ata la'ashma'ina. Is he then going to come and present the halacha like Beit Shammai and teach that? Dilma hachi kamar. Perhaps this is what he meant to say. Lo nichlaku Beit Shammai u Beit Hillel b'davar zeh. That really, that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai did not argue on this particular situation. That when it is an infant who is born circumcised, one does not have the not appropriate to desecrate Shabbat on that situation. Now, we go on now, we're about 5 lines from the bottom of 135a, right? A new statement. Amar Rav Asi. Okay? Rav Asi is going to give us now an attempt to clarify with a general principle. Kol she'imot me'ah leida. Any occasion where the mother gives birth, and in that situation she is considered tme'ah, nimol lishmona, then we will consider that a valid birth, and that male infant has a circumcision on the 8th day. The kol she'ein imot tme'ah, and a situation where a woman gives birth and she would not be considered tme'ah, leida, ein nimul lishmona. In that situation, we do not perform the circumcision on the 8th day. Shneamar, as he tries to cite a pasuk as his proof, Isha ki tazria v'yadal zachar utme'ah v'gomer. Okay, citing the pasuk that he's connecting her giving birth with her becoming tme'at vlad. Okay, and we know from previous studies that for a certain number of days she would be tme'ah after male birth, and a different number of days, by the way, after female. Uvayom hashmini yimol b'sar alato. And then the next verse continues by telling us that on the 8th day, he will have the flesh of his foreskin circumcised. Amar le Abaye, says Abaye, Dorot harishonim yochichu she'ein imo tme'ah leida v'nimo l'shmona. Abaye is going to argue here that the earlier generations, namely those that preceded the giving of the Torah, okay, prove that that's not the case, that the mother's status of tme'ah, okay, but is not a determining factor, okay, because we don't know that the law of tme'ah and Torah existed before Matan Torah. Okay? And still, we know that the practice was to have circumcision done on the 8th day. Right? Amar le, he said to him, Nitna Torah, his response. Okay? Nitna Torah v'nitchadsha halacha. He tried to argue that the Torah was, when the Torah was given, the law was renewed or redecreed, if you will. Is that possible? Right? Eini, is that really the case? Vaha itma. But wasn't it taught, okay, the following? Yotzei dofen, a child that was born by means of cesarean section, umi sheyesh lo shtei oralot, or a child that had 2 foreskins, one on top of another, okay, so to speak. Rav Huna v'Rav Chia bar Rav. There's a machloket between Rav Huna and Rav Chia bar Rav. Chad amar mechalelin alav et Shabbat. One said it's permissible to desecrate the Shabbat in that situation, to do certain Brit Milah. V'chad amar ein mechalelin. And the other said that it is not permissible to desecrate Shabbat for them. Ad kan lo plige ela lechalel alav et Shabbat. It would seem that up to this point, they only disagreed regards to Shabbat. Aval lishmona vadai mahalinim le. But we don't see any argument about when to do the circumcision, and therefore the implication would be that certainly for the 8th day, it would be invalid to do the circumcision. Ha baha talia was the response. This one is dependent on the other, namely that the desecration of Shabbat is dependent upon the bris being done on the 8th day. Okay, and one doesn't desecrate it if the bris is not to come out on the 8th day. Ketanai. So the Gemara responds to us and says, this issue of the 8th day and whether or not the mother's tumah influences, okay, it being able to desecrate Shabbat is really a machloket Tanaim. Yesh Yalid Bayit, and we now get into a long Breita. There is a situation where we have someone born, okay? Yesh Yalid Bayit Shenimul Le'echad. There is a possibility that one who was born in a household could have their circumcision on the very first day after being born. V'yesh Yalid Bayit Shenimol Lishmona. And there is the possibility that someone born in a household would have their circumcision on the 8th day. Yesh, this Breita continues, Yesh miknat kesef shenimul le'echad. There is a situation that one is purchased, okay, for money and then circumcised on the first day in the control or ownership of the new person. V'yesh miknat kesef shenimul lishmona. Excuse me. And there is also a situation where one is purchased, okay, for money, and that individual is circumcised on the 8th day. Now the Gemara is going to continue and spell out each of those kinds of situations. Now, some of them we can imagine fairly simple. Some are more complicated. Let's go on. Okay. Yesh miknat kesev shenimul le'echad. There can be a situation where one is purchased by money, okay, and is circumcised on the first day of the ownership. V'yesh miknat kesev shenimul lishmona. And there are the one who's purchased, okay, and circumcised on the 8th day. Ketzad, how is that possible? So Gemara now spells it out. Lakach shifcha me'uberet. Someone purchased as a servant a pregnant Canaanite woman. Va'achar kach yalda, and afterwards she gives birth. Zehu miknat kesef hanimul lishmona. This then is the example of one who was purchased with money, okay, and circumcised on the 8th day. Because by purchasing the mother, the master purchases the embryo, and when the embryo is now under the rishus, or under the authority of the Jew, therefore the bris is on the 8th day. Lakach shifcha v'yal velada ima. Let's say a different situation. He purchases a female Canaanite, okay, woman as a servant, and her child along with her. Zohi miknat kesef shenimul le'echad. This is an example of a purchase by money where the child is then circumcised on the first day after their purchase. Going on. V'yesh yalid bayit shenimu lishmona. And there is a situation where one is born in a household and the circumcision is on the 8th day. Ketzad, how is that? Lakach shifcha, a man purchases a servant girl, v'nit abra etzlo, and she becomes pregnant either from him or under his, during her time with him, v'yalda, and she gives birth, zehu yalid bayit hanimu lishmona. This then is a birth that has occurred in that household and the circumcision then, because she is now a Canaanite that has become a servant for Jewish master. As a result, whether he impregnated her or she became pregnant in another manner through one of the other servants, nevertheless, the child is the property of the owner, and as a result, his circumcision is on the 8th day. Rav Chama Omer, says Rav Chama, Yoda v'achar kach hitbila. What about a situation, says Rav Chama, where a woman gave birth and afterwards she immersed to become either a convert or she simply immersed as part of the requirement for Canaanite servants. Zehu yalid bayit shenimu le'echad. That also would be a situation where someone born into that household is circumcised on the first day after their birth. Hitbila, if she immersed, again, either as a convert, but more so as a servant, okay, Canaanite slave, v'achar kach yalda, and afterwards she gave birth, zehu yalid bayit hanimu lishmona. That then is a birth in a household that requires the circumcision on the 8th day. V'tanakama, and as far as Tanakama views it, lo shane le bein hatvila ve'achar kach yalda, bein yalda ve'achar kach hatvila. It would appear that for Tanakama there's no difference between whether she immersed first and then gave birth, or gave birth and then immersed. The afal gav, the ein imo tme'ah leida, because even though the mother is not considered tme'ah leida, right? He is a Hebrew servant, Canaanite servant woman, nimo lishmona. Nevertheless, that child would be circumcised on the 8th day. Now we continue. Ama Rava, this is Rava in a new situation. Bishlema the Rabbi Chama. That's understandable, acceptable to Rav Chama. Why? Mishkachat la yalid bayit nimul le'echad. Because we find a situation where it can be that one is born, excuse me, into the household and circumcised on the first day afterwards. Purchase. Yalid bayit nimo lishmona. And we have a situation where someone is born in the household and circumcised on the 8th day. Miknat kesef nimo le'echad. Purchased, okay, for money, and then that child, okay, is circumcised on the very first day after they were purchased. Umeknat kesef nimol lishmona. And another situation where we could have one purchased, okay, and then afterwards circumcised on the 8th day. And Rava continues, however, Yalda b'achar kach hitvila, if she gave birth and afterwards immersed, zehu yelid bayit shenimo le'echad. Okay, that would be a case of someone born into the household and circumcised on the first day. Hitvila b'achar kach yalda, if she immersed and afterwards gave birth, zehu yalid bayit shenimo lishmona. That would be the example of somebody born in the household where someone is born and circumcised on the 8th day. Continuing, says the Gemara, Miknat kesef l'nimul l'shmona. What about the situation of someone purchased and born, and then circumcised on the 8th day? Kigon shalakach shifcha me'uberet. Could be a situation, again, where he purchased a Canaanite servant woman who was pregnant, v'hidbila, and then she immersed, v'achar kach yalda, and afterwards she gave birth. That child then would clearly be circumcised on the 8th day. Miknat kesef nimo le'echad, a situation where one is purchased and circumcised on the first day after the purchase. Kigon shelakach ze shifcha. Okay, could be a situation where this one purchased the woman, the ze ubara, and someone else purchased the embryo. Ela latanakama vishlema kulhu mishkachet lahu. But for Tanakama, it's understood that it was all found for them. Okay, in other words, for him, for the owner. Ela liyalid bayit nimul le'echad, but rather one who was of a household and circumcised on the first day. Hechi mishkachet la. How do we find that situation? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Belokeach shifcha le'ubara. That's a situation, says Rabbi Yirmiyah, where one purchased a Canaanite slave, a servant girl, particularly for acquisition of her embryo. Hanicha leman amar kinyan perot lav kinyan haguf dami. That explanation would be acceptable according to those who hold that when you purchase the produce, you are not purchasing the object itself. In other words, you purchase the produce, but not the tree. Elalaman amar kinyan perot kinyan haguf dami. But according to those who say that when you purchase the produce, fruit, okay, it is also implies the purchase of the essential body itself. My ikalamema. What are you going to say then? Rav Masharshia. Sorry. Amar Rav Masharshia. Says Rav Masharshia, Belokeach shifcha almanat shelo lahadbila. That's a situation, he says, where one purchases the female servant, non-Jewish woman, in order so that one would not require her to go through immersion. Okay? In that situation, right, the child would remain, okay, a Jewish child, and therefore that would be the case. Tanya, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. And now we have a different topic in the Gemara. Okay? Still going to deal with issues of circumcision, but we move on to a different incident. Okay. Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer. The Braita is such that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, Kol sheshaha shloshim yom ba'adam. Okay, any human being that lives more than, okay, in other words, any birth of an infant that continues to be viable for more than 30 days, a no nefel is not considered a nefel, okay, a stillbirth, a stillborn. Shene'amar, as it says, u'piduyav mi ben chodesh tifte, based on the pasuk that says those that are to be redeemed are done so from a month on, they would be redeemed. Shmonat yamim bebehema eino nefel. And for an animal, he also said that if the animal lives, the progeny of the animal lives more than 8 days, it's also not considered a nefel, a stillborn. Shene'amar u'miyom hashmini v'hala yerotzeh lekorban. On the 8th day, it is acceptable as a sacrifice, etc. Now, okay, ha lo shaha, but he says, if it does not remain, if it does not last, sveka have, then there is a doubt, a question, and we'll go over just a little bit here. Mimhel, okay, is it hechi mahalinen le? There's a question then, if the child is not survive 30 days, how is it possible to perform circumcision? Amar Rav Ada bar Ahava, and he answers, Malino tomi manafshar. Rav Ada bar Ahava argues, we perform a circumcision in any case. Right? Right? Im chayhu, if he continues to live, shapir kamahil, then it was very well and appropriate that the infant is circumcised. Now I'm going to connect this back to one of the things we saw just a little earlier. Remember, we saw there was a question of whether the infant was born in the 7th month or the 8th month. And they imply that if it was born in the 8th month, there's more of a chance that it would be a stillborn and therefore should not be handled and not circumcised. Here, Rav Ada bar Ahava is disagreeing and saying, no, in any case, we proceed and do the circumcision. Ve'im lav, and if not, if the child does not survive, mechatech bebasarhu, then that's no different, excuse the expression, than cutting a piece of flesh. Okay? And that is not considered inflicting a wound, but it would be a kind of labor, and therefore it would be not appropriately done on Shabbat. Ve'ela, rather, says the Gemara, Hadatanya safek. But here we have a Braita that teaches that when it's questionable, bein sheva safek, bein shmona, whether it's a doubtful, questionable, whether it's 7 month or 8 month, ein mechalalina lavita Shabbat, that we're not permitted to desecrate Shabbat. Amai? Why is that the case? Again, you might say, Nim hale, let us circumcise him, Nim anavshach. In either case, Im chayhu shapir kamahil. If he continues to live, all the better. It's well and appropriate circumcision. Ve'im lav, and if not, nechatech babasarhu. Then it's simply no different than cutting a piece of meat. Amar Mar Bered the Ravina, says Mar in the name of Ravina, Ana v'Rav Nechume bar Zechariah, Tirgimna. I and Rabbi Nechume bar Zechariah explained it this way. Mimhil, okay, we do circumcise him. Hachi nami mahalinen le. Here too we circumcise him. Lo nitzracha ela lemachshire mila. That where we said the concern about the Mechalel Shabbat was in regards to the preparations for the circumcision. Va'aliba the Rabbi Eliezer. And this was based according to the view of Rabbi Eliezer, who, remember we said, who permitted all sorts of preparations to be done on Shabbat, even heating up, gathering wood to make a fire, to heat up metal if you didn't have the knife there. Okay? And that's where we're going to stop there this morning. Okay, and I wish everybody to stay well and have a good day and take care.
Thank you, Rabbi. Take care.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. Be well.
Okay,
Stay well.
be well, everybody.